Okay, so thank you, Melissa. So you can see I'm just joined by three colleagues. It's not shorts weather here, it's actually raining outside. So what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about the IPCC story. And if any of you are involved in CSIRO, tomorrow there'll be another lecture which will actually talk about the science of IPCC, in particular with respect to the oceans. But what I'll do is talk really about how IPCC came about, how it actually turned out in the fourth and fifth assessment report, and perhaps I'll feature what happened in the final plenary session. So just to kind of remind us about IPCC, IPCC is really a collaboration.
We got the wrong one. Sorry.
No, you're right. Come in. IPCC is really about a collaboration of the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations Environment Programme. The IPCC has a secretariat, if you like, and the famous or infamous Rajendra Pachauri is the chair of IPCC. We have another collection of people, but the main activity in IPCC is these working groups. Working Group 1, Working Group 2, Working Group 3, and the task force around greenhouse gas inventories. Now, I'm going to give you just sort of one slice of this, the slice being through Working Group 1 and the activities that have gone on there. And the bit that's famous actually is right at the bottom here. This is the reports that are created by something like 800 scientists who contribute to the various reports that are reported. The first one was actually released on the 27th of September. The second report around impact and adaptation will come in March or April next year, and there'll be another 3 months later for the mitigation. The key people from point of view of these reports is actually the two co-chairs. Susan Solomon and Dahir Kin were actually the chairs for the fourth assessment report. Thomas Stocker, and I'll show you some pictures of him later so you'll know who it is, and Dahir Kin were in the fifth assessment. So Dahir Kin's actually been there for 2 assessment reports. Shigeru, come and join us. So if you think about climate change science, back in the late 1980s, there was a lot of discussion around climate change. Bert Bolin was started to talk about how we could change the climate. Then Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan started to understand actually this might be important. And there's this apocryphal story that they decided that, yes, we should have these reports and assessments of climate change, and they should be to governments. And the question is, why would you bother with making these reports? After all, you could read the scientific literature, and then, of course, when you realise how big the literature has grown to, you understand that actually no one in policy, no one in politics is actually going to ever read the sorts of literature that's required for understanding climate change. So the job became, well, given that there's something like 10,000 papers that are actually in the fifth assessment report, a little bit less in the fourth assessment report, no one can understand that. So there's really a problem of scale. So if you're a policymaker or a decision maker, you need someone else to do the work for you, and this is how the scientific communities became involved. It's not only there's there too much literature, actually, around some of the issues in climate change science, there's too little literature, and that's an issue as well. But one of the virtues of IPCC is that actually you begin to identify the areas where there's too little literature, and as a consequence, actually, it motivates and stimulates further research. And finally, of course, climate change science cuts across many disciplines, and so it really means that collaboration is mandatory, and it's really important to distill the science down into a few meaningful chunks. And I'll illustrate that in the Working Group 1 report. There's 1.2 million words, and we've distilled it down to 2 A4 pages in the summary for policymakers. So if you think about it, that's an enormous collapse of what has been published in the last 7 years down to something that pretty much any decision maker could read, especially if you're thinking about mitigating for climate change. And the other thing that was really important is that this report is meaningful in the sense that it's got to be credible, right? If you're going to rely on reports like this, they've got to be credible. And if to be credible, what do they have to have? They've got to have lots of reviews. And so there were 3 rounds of reviews for the 5th assessment report and the 4th assessment report. And to be credible, you need to be really up to date with the current state of knowledge. And it's not simply a review, so it's an assessment, and by assessment, we actually mean get rid of the chaff, right? Get rid of the stuff that is irrelevant. And you've got to be policy relevant, and policy relevant's different to being scientific relevant. You've actually got to deal with the things in the climate system that you care about or are the source of controversies, and there are a couple of examples. The current pause in temperature is a controversy, and so to be relevant, we've got to address that. From a climate perspective, in the physical sciences, the fate of ice sheets, sea level, are really important issues. The importance of atmospheric compositional changes, so the forcings that drive the climate system, are really important too, and therefore incredibly important to thinking about the policy relevance. They're not necessarily totally important in the science, but they are to climate change. And a lot of people ask, well, is it really worthwhile to do this kind of thing in the research community? And here's what I would describe as the positives. First of all, we have collaboration across hundreds of climate scientists, and so it actually stimulates a lot of the scientific activity. There's a few anecdotes. GRL had more papers come into its editorial office in the weeks leading up to the deadlines around climate change, the cut-off times for the 5th assessment report. And so actually it's stimulating a lot of activity. And it pushes actually the observations, particularly in oceans and ice sheets, and it stimulates the communities to update their assessments of these things. And so it drives our scientific knowledge around climate change. There are a few people who will tell you that there are some negatives. Carl Wunsch here, by the way, is kind of the father of some modern aspects of oceanography, in particular the use of observations with theory. And he would say, oh, IPCC should be done every 20 years, not every 6 years. And that's because actually these reports tend to be incremental. They're evolutionary in progress. On the other hand, if you think about it, actually climate science cuts across all of the fields of disciplines. And in fact, while some disciplines are slow, maybe oceans are slow, some other parts have evolved more rapidly. And so in fact, across the entire report and across each new assessment, you have new results. And so this question about timescale is an interesting one, given the magnitude of the effort by the community to deliver these reports. So just to give you a sense of what we did over the last 4 years to actually arrive at the plenary session in September of this year, we had a scoping meeting in 2009. That's actually where we identified the new science and identified what needed to be done. We actually designed what the 5th assessment report would look like. So that's 5 years ago. 4 years ago when we were designing the 5th assessment report. We had a few other things because we knew there were some hot issues. There was a hot issue around sea level because of our dawning and the revolution that's occurring in ice sheets and our understanding of both Greenland and Antarctica. In 2010, there was the selection of the lead authors. The lead authors are selected on the basis of actually being nominated. So you nominate to be a lead author in the assessment reports, and you're selected on the basis of your scientific merit, and also because it's a United Nations thing, depending on whether you're from a developing country or not. So part of the activity against IPCC is actually to train developing countries and upskill them in the areas of climate change science. And then we had the various meetings, one in China, Brest, Marrakesh, roughly a year apart, to the final draft. Take that away. That's my phone. To the final draft in 2013. And the final draft was submitted 23rd of May for the technical summary, 13th of May for each of the chapters, and the final draft in the 1st of June. And these drafts were sent out to governments for a final review. And then we had the plenary session in September of this year, where there was, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in coming slides. Now, you can see that the IPCC process is quite ponderous. There's a lot of work involved in getting to the final document. And as a consequence, some people have really positive things to say about it. Now, Jeffrey Sachs actually received a real Nobel Prize in economics. So he's a bright guy, and I'd have to agree with him that IPCC is a remarkable example of getting the expert community together to inform policymakers, right? And Tim Flannery, of course, is a Australian of the Year. He's famous too, and actually he has a point of view that has some merit as well. These reports are as dull as dishwater. So the thing about IPCC is that it tries to develop a language which can be used across all of the reports. And in fact, you can see some of this language appearing in the scientific literature as well. There's a kind of calibrated language. Because of the presence of uncertainty in observations, in theory, we often like to, and because of the disagreement or high levels of agreement across the scientific literature, we have this confidence language, which is actually illustrated in this upper left panel. So where you have many more reports and papers where there's actually high agreement, you would talk about high agreement. And if it's really good evidence, so rising sea level is an example with robust evidence, then you would be over here in this top right-hand corner with high confidence. This bar here is the confidence level. If, on the other hand, we were talking about detection of human influence on the Antarctic ice sheet, actually all the papers disagree with each other, so they're low on agreement. And whilst there's some good evidence, actually it's not all even, and so you would tend to perhaps be over here, low agreement, medium evidence, modest confidence in the assessment. But where you actually have really good scientific results and you can quantify it, that is, it's gone through some kind of numerical model and have very good observations, you can actually talk at a higher level in terms of a likelihood scale, going from exceptionally unlikely through to virtually certain, okay? So I've sort of emphasised that it's a long and lengthy process to get there, and therefore there are teams, and this is actually the team that we had for the 5th assessment report in the chapter on detection and attribution. And just to kind of illustrate what these chapters look like, here is the actual title of chapter 10, and you can see there are 2 coordinating lead authors, if you like, and then there's 15 other lead authors here, and you can see their distribution from a variety of countries, developed and underdeveloped. And then what we do is we have 3 review editors down here, and the purpose of these review editors is to make sure that actually IPCC reports the assessments and responses to reviewers accurately. In previous years, you might have seen in some of the blogs that some changes were made, and there was the suggestion that they were done on the sly, that they weren't done correctly, and that they were put in at the end to just meet a certain purpose. So there was the suggestion actually that some aspects of the IPCC process was faulty. The review editors were introduced in the third assessment report, and those review editors are there to make sure that actually the roughly 4,000 review comments that we got over the 3 rounds were actually treated correctly by the by the lead authors. And just to give you a sense, these 4,000 review comments that we receive, we actually enter up into a spreadsheet, and every comment has a response to it in the spreadsheets. Every comment has a response to it, and those comments will become available. And what will happen is that people will track through the comments to check against the text to see whether we've actually responded correctly and fairly to those comments. And in the fourth assessment, there was actually one PhD dissertation around the process of the commenting and what was actually in the final document. So there's some really interesting kinds of things that are spun off from the IPCC. And if you look at this third group here, these are the contributing authors. There's another 58 contributing authors that our particular chapter actually consulted with to make the final 50 word pages of text that are involved in this particular chapter. If you think about it, there's roughly 239 lead authors involved in the working group 1, and there's another 600 or so contributing authors, so making about 800 people who've contributed one way or another to the 5th assessment report. And overall, 1,100 experts, roughly from 38 governments, actually contributed to each of these review stages. Across the entire document, there were 55,000 comments that were responded to. So let me now sort of cut to the chase, because at the summary for policymakers, which was actually accepted in September, we had the final meeting. So whilst there's 1.2 million words around the 14 chapters of the assessment, the bit that governments really care about is actually the summary for policymakers. And the summary for policymakers has to be agreed by governments. So there's 110 governments that turn up. And in this picture, you can actually see the Australian government representatives. There's these 3 people here. So Anthony, Neville and Lucy. And then you can see the Australian scientists that were involved in the final plenary session. Now, this is the only time actually you would have seen the government delegates with the Australian scientists. The role of the delegates is actually to approve the text. Okay, so they're there on behalf of the Australian government to approve or disapprove the text as they like. The purpose of the scientists is to actually keep the science true to the assessment of the underlying literature. So the scientist's role is really only there about the science. Now, when we get to the plenary session, the task over 4 days, okay, so there's 4 days to agree on the 14,000 words that go into the summary for policymakers. The governments have all seen the initial draft and the second draft, and the main job at hand is just to get approval across those 110 countries. And so what's the procedure? So the procedure is pretty simple in some ways and complicated in other ways. The procedure is simply to literally agree line by line the text that's in the summary for policymaker. It includes, let me just go back, it includes texts, tables, figures, footnotes, everything. Everything has to be agreed, and as you agree to every new sentence, it's gavelled down. When it's gavelled down, it's agreed, you don't go back, okay? And the bit where the drama occurs is when people disagree, okay? So if they disagree and we cannot agree on the text, it's left out. So just imagine what the summary for policymakers is. It starts from the observations, it ends with the projections. And if you only get through half of it, then you'll agree on the observations and maybe something around detection and attribution, and you'll just forget all about the projections into the future. If you can't agree on the last half of the text, it's missing, all right? It's just missing. So that would be a disaster. And all the decisions are by consensus. So if you think about that, you've got 110 countries out in front of you, and all of them have to agree, right? And if any of them dissent, the process gets held up and you go and have discussions and you come to agreement or not. So you would think, one would surely think, that this must be unstable. It must lead to a disaster every time. And maybe it does. So in the summary for policymakers, this is really some of the essential evidence across a whole suite of indicators of the changing climate. Spring snow cover, sea ice extent, the rising temperatures of the ocean, how global sea levels going up, the atmosphere's changing, ocean acidity is increasing, partial pressure of carbon dioxide is going up. These are all evidence of the these are from observations. They're all evidence of the changing state of the climate system. Okay, they're just a statement about how the ocean has actually how the climate system has actually changed. So it's this kind of observations that allows us to come to the conclusion for the policymakers that the warming in the climate system is unequivocal because of the many lines of evidence reflected in these figures. This is very similar to a statement that we made in the fourth assessment report. In the fourth assessment report, we said that warming in the climate system is unequivocal. And there's a nice story that goes with this sentence, actually. You can imagine there's 110 nations out there, and you have this sentence up there, and in fact, the nations are trying to wordsmith every word. And we come across the unequivocal word, and you get into a discussion about how this word translates into 4 different languages. Remember, United Nations report appear in Russian, French, Spanish, and English. And we finally had the French representative stand up and say, unequivocal is unequivocal. And then the Spanish representative stood up and said, in Spanish, unequivocal is unequivocal. And we gavelled the sentence down and breathed a sigh of relief, because this is actually a sentence that we thought represented the underlying science. So, you have these little wrinkles in getting across the line. Actually, in the 5th assessment report, this sentence went straight through. No one quivered. No one.
It was unequivocal.
It was unequivocal. No one gave us trouble on that. It was straightforward. We were worried about it in some level. And then the report is also about the evidence around human influence on the climate system. And to my mind, this, I hope, will be an iconic figure actually in the 5th assessment report. And really this is based on thinking about all the things that show the effects of human influence. So the blue lines here are the alternative hypothesis that it's actually to do with natural variations, i.e. volcanic eruptions, internal variability, changes in solar forcing. And you can see in every case except Antarctica that basically where you include all the forcings, so that's including greenhouse gases and aerosols, in every case the greenhouse gases, aerosols plus the other forcings is separating out very nicely in the second half of the 20th century from the experience of natural variability across continental areas, across sea ice, across the oceans, and at global scales. And we have other evidence actually against snow, ice, global sea level, and also extremes. So if you took all of this evidence, what you can actually say is that human influence on the climate system is clear. Maybe that's too simple, but it's actually kind of a summation of all of the things that have changed in the climate system. By the way, the word clear is a synonym for unequivocal. It's clearer. But the other thing that we were able to say quite strongly, and which was actually leaked repeatedly in the lead up to the plenary session, is that across all these lines of evidence, it's extremely likely that the human influence has been the dominant cause of climate change. And that's an important statement because it's a strengthening of what we understood in the fourth assessment report. Extremely likely here means we're 95% certain that human influence is more than half of the changes. In the fourth assessment report, it was 90% very likely. But more importantly, in this report, we're actually really able to quantify the contributions from human influence here and the alternative hypotheses, if you like, there's natural variability and internal variability shown down here. And if you think about it, what this figure is showing is the observations. Here is the combination of greenhouse gases plus aerosols, which makes up this anthropogenic influence, the things that man has control over and causes, if you like. And there's the contributions from natural and internal variability since 1951. And if you look at this graph, you would say there's no contribution from natural variability, there's no contribution from internal variability. Okay, anthropogenic, things that are anthropogenically controlled is actually enough to explain all of the observations. And this is an important point because what it's really telling us is that man did it all. And so we actually added this sentence in here, and we wrote this because there's a lot of confusion around what the dominant influence means. So whilst it's not as strong or rigorous in the sense that we're extremely likely it's 95% sure, our best estimates tell us that the human-induced contribution is the same as the observed period over the same as the observed warming since 1951. So man, at the first level, is causing all of the observed changes. Now, at the end of the third day, remember there's only 4 days to approve the 14,000 words. At the end of the third day, at about 6 p.m, we had approved 20% of the words. So we were going great guns. The amount of time that had actually gone through was 70%. So we worked on into the night. So this is about 6 o'clock. We worked it to about 3 p.m. the next morning. We then went home, got back and came back to work at 8 a.m. And then we worked through to 5 a.m. of the following day. So 5 a.m. on Friday, the day that we released the summary for policymakers, we were still approving the text. And all of us were working all the time. There was no, you can see this fella here, he's got his headphones on. He's still listening. But we actually got to the end. And every bit of text was actually agreed to. We had to make some modifications because there was one controversial subject around the carbon budget. You know, how much carbon could we emit before we actually crossed the 2-degree threshold? And so there was a bit of extra work that we had to do at about 3 or 4 a.m. of the Friday morning. But actually, at the end of the day, everything was agreed. And then the press came. And this is, in fact, the room where and this is the press. There's no scientist in this picture. And the remarkable thing in my mind is actually that 110 nations agreed to that 14,000 words of text that's in the summary for policymakers. Now, that's an extraordinary thing because it's pretty hard to get 3 scientists to agree to a sentence. But we managed to get 110 nations to actually agree. And the other extraordinary thing is that actually the science was respected in every case. So often we would be having these discussions with, for instance, the line about the human influence is clear. And the Saudi Arabians were, we were standing there, and the Saudi Arabians were there, and the Germans were over here, and the Germans wanted to ramp up the language, and the Saudi Arabians just wanted us to stick to the language we'd written. And in that discussion, we carefully went through all the lines of evidence that actually made the sentence, and they'd said, you can stick to that. That's what we'll accept. And curiously, I asked them later, after they'd gone off, to make sure that they were happy with the sentence that was being discussed. They came back and said, yes, we're happy to agree to that text. It turned out they were not happy with the whole of the text, but they were happy to agree to the science. And they trusted the science and what was reported. They didn't want to change it. They didn't want to elevate things more. The Germans wanted to elevate the language even more strongly. So it's a very interesting tussle there between what is underlying the words that we wrote, the scientists wrote, in effect, on behalf of the governments. But the good thing is actually the underlying science remained there. And so, in fact, we got to the press conference and we got to actually answer the questions from the press and release the summary for policymakers. And really, this slide just reflects on the fact that we went from over 4 years, 1.2 million words, to 19 headline statements in 2 pages that anyone could actually read, and it's all based on the evidence that we have in the peer-reviewed literature. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nathan. Should we open it up to questions? I don't quite know how to.
Go ahead.
Let me turn. Perhaps if we go around the institutions first up. I will say Melbourne had some technical issues and weren't able to dial in, so apologies from Melbourne. We start with you, Taz, first. Any questions?
Folk, any questions?
So I have I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment. One of your earlier slides talked about one of the benefits of the IPCC report, and one of those benefits was an increase in papers submitted to GRL, and presumably others. Would you comment on the quality of those papers?
I think we should ask Peter Strutton about the quality of the papers. It's true. There's a bit of a risk with deadlines that the quality gets sacrificed. It's all a little bit about being relevant, right? So the deadline increases the relevance and the pressure to address certain issues. But I think also because we have over 4 years all these lead author meetings, that actually drives a lot of the conversation. So formally, IPCC never commissions science, okay? IPCC just reports on it. But because a lot of people are actually in the process of discussing issues around climate change science, you see that actually they're formulating papers as they go along. And so it's sort of, in a sense, it's not driven at all by IPCC. It comes out more or less spontaneously from those meetings and gatherings of the scientists. You furrowed your brow there, but they're not commissioned by IPCC. They just occur spontaneously, if I can put it that way.
I suppose I agree that they're not commissioned by the IPCC, but there's no doubt that the IPCC timetable has a big influence on how science is both published and performed.
That's right. And part of it's from the conversations, and part of it's a little bit of the pressure from the timelines. Right. Let's have questions from another group.
Monash? No? Or shall I go? We're getting shaky heads. Throw it to my group here. Yep, I can see Eric has one. I don't know that people can see you, Eric. Pop your head over.
Hi, Nathan. So, would you do it again? Is there going to be AR6, and so would you do it again? If not, would you recommend other people do it?
So, Eric, climate change science is contentious, okay? And the very fact that it's contentious means that we should do it again. Because you need to report the science and you need to summarise it up so that it can be used by others, right? So the very nature of the contention means that you have to continue to invest in having clear information, clearer. Some people say IPCC is not clear, but clear statements and assessments of the science because of the contention. So we must actually have it. And in the protocols around the United Frameworks Climate Change Convention, there is going to be a sixth assessment. Exactly what its form is another question, but it will be there. Should scientists be involved? Absolutely. You should go and get involved, all of you. Maybe don't be a coordinating lead author. It leads to injuries and all sorts of things. Maybe skip that one, but definitely be involved. It's really good. It's good because of the collaborations you develop, the people you get to meet, the science that gets discussed. You get to see the gaps. Invaluable.
Hi Nathan, I just wanted to follow up on Will's question. And in your pros and cons, you didn't say anything about the effect that the IPCC process has on the CMIT process. So do you think it's detrimental to sort of model development that we have these deadlines placed on model development?
It's actually it's pros and cons a little bit. If there was no IPCC, if there was no concerted effort for a coherent, planned activity around simulating the future climate, you wouldn't have the CMIP as active as it is. Many of the governments invest in that modelling process so that those countries really do contribute to the IPCC reports. So if you think about it, IPCC climate change leads to investments in those countries which have climate models in those countries, okay? And it's that relevance to policymakers, the relevance of the issue, that means we really get as much support as we do for CMIP 5 and the earlier simulations. The fact is that 7 years is, it's a little bit like that discussion around Carl Wunsch, right? 7 years is a slightly short period of time for the rate of progress in model capability, that it puts a lot of pressure on the modelling groups themselves. But if we didn't have IPCC, if we didn't have this burning issue of climate change, the modelling wouldn't be coordinated at all. It would be far more disparate. So whilst you kind of pitched it as a negative, actually I think the reason we have a lot of the simulations going at all is because of the importance of this issue. Does that make sense to you? It's a bit the other way around to how you said it.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Any more questions from here?
Yes, Paul.
Hi. Curious if there's a tendency for, or just your views on if there's a tendency for the authors involved in the IPCC chapters to cite their own work or work with that, if it's actually a fair assessment of all the literature, or is it an assessment of the literature of the authors are somehow connected to? How do they, is there just a natural tendency for people to put their own work in, or the work that they're somewhat loosely involved in?
Yeah, there's some tendency, but actually the tendency is probably weaker than it is in just the normal peer-reviewed literature. It's always a bit tricky, isn't it? You're supposed to be an expert in climate change. You've probably written papers which show that expertise in climate change. You might possibly quote some of your own work. But what often happens is other people quote it as well, and so it doesn't matter so much. Perhaps the bigger issue might be that some people, we put a lot of effort into the figures, and some figures do look like some of the publications in papers and so on. So there's a tendency to do a bit of that. I think that would be a fair comment. One of the purposes of the review editors and, of course, the review rounds is to comment on the figures as well. And so a lot of figures. So in the drafts that we start off with, the figures evolve actually with each round, and progressively you get further and further away from the specific figures that have appeared in the publications. They get built upon. They bring new information. They tend to integrate things across a number of papers. And so the primary tendency is actually to create new and original figures that are basically aggregations of what exists in the literature. So that's the more common tendency.
You said that climate change is still contested, so IPCC is necessary. But can you comment on the effectiveness of IPCC?
Yeah, it's 1,000-fold more effective than a single paper in the Journal of Climate, and you can work it out from the citation rates of IPCC and the summary for policymakers with respect to most of the literature that appears. It's very effective because 110 nations turn up and actually decide on the text. That means they've read it, and it means it's reported internally in the governments. It means that for once the science community is actually interacting with the governments. So relative to what's published in the science literature, in the peer-reviewed literature, which typical citations run from 10 to 50 in the last 5 years, it has an enormous impact. And because of the design, because of the sort of apocryphal story I told you about Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan trying to exclude the non-governmental organisations, literally, right? They didn't want Greenpeace there, they didn't want others there. It means that actually it does lead to a conversation between governments. And so, in a sense, that alone is what makes IPCC much more successful than an anarchic or ad hoc approach to the issue of climate change. Uh-oh.
Could I extend on Tanya's question and ask you about the utility of the SPM specifically? I'm wondering, I can see how government leaders and people would want to use it as a quick way to get themselves up to speed, but when they take that interest in climate change back to their people and start planning action around climate change, I assume those people are going to dive into the report itself. Do you think that the SPM is just useful for getting climate change on government's radars, or do you think it's the go-to document for planners and policymakers in a literal sense?
So my impression is that for mitigation and around the United Frameworks Convention on Climate Change, so that's what is the basis of negotiating the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, this document addresses a lot of that, and so it's very relevant to that issue around mitigation of climate change. Many developing countries actually have no resource for thinking about climate change and their area or as a policy document. They have no other independent resource. So for many countries, many underdeveloped countries, it's the primary source of information. And then I've lost my train of thought, but so I think the answer is I've lost it.
That's okay. Thank you anyway.
Question.
Hi Nathan.
when you're talking about how the science is respected and essentially trusted, it made me think of a comment I heard recently. There was an article in The Economist, which I haven't read. I heard the author of the article speaking on the radio. And I suspect it was a bit about climate change, but it was more about, where the world is going economically and the role of Asia, etc. And he made this throwaway comment where he said, in some countries, politicians, because they come from fields like engineering and science, don't waste time bickering about the fundamentals of science, like, whether the radiative forcing from greenhouse effect is the way the scientists say it is. And they save a lot of time because they go straight to the conversations that really matter. So I was just wondering, do you have the delegates that you have seem to respect and trust the science? What's their background and, what happens to them when they go back, which is kind of going to make what James was alluding to. Do you have a sense of that other side of the process?
So the delegates are a mixture of clever bureaucrats and scientists. So it's a mixed crowd, actually, but a lot of these delegates also go on to further negotiations around mitigation of climate change. So they're actually, so my impression is that they're a very bright, intelligent crowd, but they also are there negotiating on behalf of their country at some level, right? And so that they actually have, I'm looking for a term. They actually have a plan and a brief on what they're allowed to accept or not accept. Okay, so actually they come with an agenda themselves, but in the room, it's more important to agree and have a document than not to agree. Okay, but the negotiations, the harder negotiations, will be around commitments to climate change, and there you can see that the arguments will scatter much more. So my impression is that the science is accepted. They do push it forwards, but in any decision-making process, science is only one part of it. Sorry, guys, actually science isn't the most important thing. It could be politics, dogma, it could be the economy, it could be anything, right? So there's many other factors, and it's the same in nearly any other environmental matter. Do we have a solution? And so it's those other issues that often drive the thinking that goes on in the negotiations. Because there's a fear, right? It's the fear of the consequence of agreeing to something.